The candles on the small, store-bought cake had melted into wax puddles before Lyra even found the courage to blow them out. "Make a wish, sweetheart," her mother, Rosa, said gently from across the kitchen table. Lyra stared at the flickering flames and almost laughed. What was she supposed to wish for? 40 years old, sitting in her childhood kitchen in Brooklyn, still wearing the blue dress she'd put on 3 hours earlier, with something close to hope. The date had seemed promising on paper. A financial consultant, decent job, her cousin's co-worker. They'd met at a quiet Italian place, 2 blocks from here. He'd smiled through the appetizers, and then, somewhere between the second glass of wine and the entree, he'd leaned back, looked her up and down, and said it plainly. "I have to be honest. I pictured someone smaller and younger, if I'm being real with you." He'd said it like he was doing her a favor, like honesty excused cruelty. Lyra had sat there, fork frozen halfway to her mouth, and felt every year and every pound settle onto her shoulders like stones. "I'm done, Ma," Lyra said now, staring at the cake instead of blowing it out. "I mean it this time. No more setups. No more dating apps. No more waiting by the phone like some pathetic teenager. I'm 40. I run my own accounting practice. I don't need a man to complete a life I already built." Rosa reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You deserve someone who sees you, Lyra, not someone who measures you. Nobody's going to see me, Ma. That's the whole problem. Men want the packaging. I stopped being packaging material 15 pounds and 1 bakery bankruptcy ago." Lyra finally blew out the candles, the smoke curling up between them like a small private funeral. "I'm swearing off romance, officially, as my birthday gift to myself." She meant it. Every bruised, exhausted cell in her body meant it. That was when the headlights hit the living room window. Not one set. 3. Rosa moved to the curtain first, peering out with the wariness of someone who'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know when something didn't belong. "Lyra," she said, voice tight, "come look at this." 3 black SUVs sat parked along the curb, engines idling, blocking the narrow driveway entirely. Men in dark suits stepped out of the first and third vehicles, positioning themselves like sentries, eyes scanning the quiet street with a stillness that felt almost military. "Man, get away from the window." Lyra's pulse kicked up. She thought immediately of her failed bakery, of unpaid invoices, of anyone she might owe money to. Nothing came to mind that warranted this kind of entrance. The middle car's door opened last. He stepped out unhurried, buttoning his suit jacket like a man arriving at a business meeting rather than a stranger's front door. Even from behind the curtain, Lyra could see he was younger than she expected, early 30s maybe, with the kind of composed, watchful expression that made the guards around him seem like decoration rather than protection. He didn't need them. That much was obvious in the way he moved. Rosa's hand found Lyra's arm. "That's Paxilano," she whispered, her voice dropping the way people's voices dropped when they said certain names out loud in this city. "Lyra, that's the Castellano boy. He runs half of what used to be his father's operation. People don't talk about him. People go quiet. Why would a name like that be standing on our porch?" She got her answer 30 seconds later, when the doorbell rang. Lyra opened it, because her mother's hands were shaking too badly to manage the latch. Paxton Castellano stood on the small concrete step, hands loosely clasped in front of him, and for a moment he simply looked at her, not scanning her body the way the man at dinner had, not measuring her the way strangers always seem to, but looking at her face, like he'd been waiting a long time to see it in person. "Mrs. Vasilenko," he said, addressing Rosa directly, his tone formal, almost old-fashioned. "Forgive the hour. I wanted to come while I still had the courage." "Courage for what?" Rosa managed. Paxton didn't glance at his guards. He didn't posture. He simply reached into his jacket and produced a slim leather folder. holding it out not to Lyra but to her mother, a gesture so deliberately respectful it stunned Lyra into silence. "I've come to ask your permission," he said, "to marry your daughter." The words landed in the small living room like something dropped from a great height. Rosa's mouth opened, no sound coming out. Lyra felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I know how this looks," Paxson continued, finally turning to Lyra, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. "I know you don't know me, but I've known about you for a very long time, Lyra. Longer than you'd believe." He held the folder out to her now. Inside, she would soon discover, was a marriage contract. Binding, notarized, and disturbingly thorough, as if it had been drafted months, not hours, in advance. "I'm not asking you to love me tonight," Paxson said quietly, guards silent behind him, the street holding its breath. "I'm only asking you not to say no before you understand why I'm here." Lyra looked down at the folder in her hands, then back up at the stranger, who somehow already knew her name, her mother's address, and, impossibly, something about her he wasn't yet explaining. Her birthday wish, it seemed, had arrived before she'd even made it. 3 days after the folder had landed in her hands, Lyra found herself in the back seat of one of those same black SUVs, driving north, out of the city, toward a version of New York she'd never seen. One made of rolling hills, iron gates, and silence so complete it felt manufactured. She hadn't signed anything, not yet. But her mother's hands hadn't stopped shaking since that night, and Lyra had a growing, uneasy feeling that Rosa knew something she wasn't saying. So Lyra had made a decision. She would go to Paxson's estate herself, face him directly, and get real answers before any signature touched that contract. "Temporary," she'd told her mother. "I'm going to find out what this man actually wants, and then I'm coming home." The estate itself looked less like a Mafia stronghold and more like something out of an architecture magazine. Stone and glass, cameras discreetly tucked into hedges, guards who nodded at her, like she already belonged there. It unsettled her more than gunmen would have. Gunmen she could understand. Quiet, polished normalcy from a man people went silent about. That took real power. Paxson met her in the entrance hall, dressed down from the suit she'd seen him in, sleeves rolled to his forearms. "You came," he said, like he hadn't been certain she would. "I came for answers, not a wedding date." "Fair." He gestured down the hall. "Then let's start with my study. I think it'll answer more than I could in words." She followed him, spine straight, refusing to be impressed by the art, the woodwork, the sheer scale of a home built by money she didn't want to think too hard about the origins of. But when he pushed open the study door and stepped aside, whatever composure she'd been holding on to cracked. The walls were covered in frames, not photographs, not awards, spreadsheets, audit reports, printed and matted and hung like fine art, corners yellowed slightly with age. Lyra stepped closer, frowning, and then went cold as she recognized the formatting, the specific way she used to flag discrepancies in red, the particular restructuring model she'd developed herself, back when she was 29 and freelancing anonymously for a financial recovery firm that never told her whose books she was actually fixing. "These are mine," she said quietly. "I did these 10 years ago." "I know." Paxson's voice had lost its formal edge. It was rougher now, almost unguarded. "I was 22 when my father died and left me a syndicate that was 3 months from total collapse. Debts nobody could trace, shell companies bleeding money in 6 directions, people circling like vultures waiting for me to fail so they could pick apart what was left." Lyra turned to face him, arms crossed, trying to hold on to her anger, and finding it slipping. "I hired a recovery firm out of desperation," he continued. "They brought in an outside analyst, anonymous, by request. No name, no face. just numbers. And God, Lyra, the numbers she sent back saved everything. She found 4 hollowed-out accounts my father's own lawyer was skimming from. She restructured debt nobody thought could be restructured. She built a 5-year model that turned the whole operation legitimate enough to survive federal scrutiny. He gestured at the walls. I asked the firm for her name. They refused. Confidentiality, they said. So I kept the reports instead. I framed them. I told myself if I ever found her, I'd thank her properly. That's... Lyra shook her head, the room tilting slightly. That's not the kind of thing you frame for 10 years, Paxson. People move on. I didn't. He said it simply, without drama, which somehow made it land harder. I spent a decade quietly digging through firm records, tracing signatures, chasing invoices that led nowhere. 2 years ago, an old contact finally cracked the anonymization, gave me a name, Lyra Vasilenko, freelance forensic accountant, Brooklyn. Lyra's stomach dropped. You've known who I was for 2 years? I've watched from a distance for 2 years, he corrected, and for the first time, something like vulnerability crossed his face. I watched you build your own practice from nothing. I watched your bakery fail and watched you rebuild anyway, instead of breaking. I watched men underestimate you at every turn because they only ever looked at your body and never once at your mind. He took a step closer, and Lyra didn't retreat. I didn't fall in love with your face, Lyra. I fell in love with the woman who could look at a syndicate on the verge of collapse and see, in the numbers, a way to save it. I fell in love with your mind first. Everything else just confirmed what I already knew. Lyra stood very still, staring at the framed proof of her own forgotten genius hanging on a stranger's wall, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not trust yet, not even close, but curiosity, sharp and undeniable, and beneath it, something more dangerous. The first flicker of being truly seen. That still doesn't explain, she said carefully, why you needed a marriage contract instead of just a phone call. Paxson's jaw tightened, the warmth in his expression dimming into something guarded. That, he said, is a longer conversation, one I'm not sure you're ready to hear yet. Lyra felt the unease return, colder this time. Try me. He only shook his head and turned back toward the door. Not tonight. Tonight, I just wanted you to know the truth started with numbers, not with a contract. He paused at the threshold, not quite looking at her. The contract came later, for reasons that have nothing to do with love and everything to do with keeping you and your mother safe. Lyra didn't sleep that night. She lay in one of the estate's guest rooms, softer sheets than she'd ever owned, a view of dark hills instead of a fire escape, turning Paxson's words over and over until they lost their shape. Keeping you and your mother safe. Safe from what? He hadn't answered, and she hadn't pushed, too unsettled by the wall of frames and the strange ache of being understood by a man she still didn't trust. By morning, she'd made up her mind. If Paxson wouldn't give her the full truth, she'd find it herself, starting with the one person who'd agreed to all of this far too quickly. She told the guard at the gate she needed air. Then she called a car and went home to Brooklyn. Rosa wasn't expecting her. Lyra let herself in with her spare key and found her mother at the kitchen table, not making cake this time, but sorting through a stack of papers she shoved into a drawer the second the door opened. "Lyra, I didn't know you were... What was that?" Lyra nodded at the drawer, something instinctive already tightening in her chest. 10 years of reading financial documents had trained her eyes to catch guilt in the smallest movements. A folder closed too fast, a drawer shut with too much force. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just old bills. Ma." Lyra crossed the kitchen and pulled the drawer open before her mother could stop her. Inside was a thick folder, edges worn soft from handling, and on top, A letter stamped with a logo Lyra recognized instantly. Silverline Capital Partners. A name that made her stomach clench. She'd audited companies like this before. Predatory lenders dressed up in respectable branding, the kind that buried desperate people under interest rates, disguised in fine print. "Ma, why do you have a Silverline loan document?" Rosa's face crumpled, and just like that, 5 years of silence broke apart. "It was after your bakery closed," she said quietly. "You were drowning, Lyra. Vendors calling, the lease, the equipment loans. I couldn't watch you lose everything you'd built, so I took out a loan, just to cover the worst of it, just until you got back on your feet." Lyra's hands went cold as she pulled the folder fully open and started reading. The numbers didn't make sense at first, and then they made too much sense. An initial loan of $40,000 had ballooned, through compounding interest and rolled over fees, into something well past $200,000. 5 years of quiet, crushing debt her mother had carried alone, telling no one, protecting Lyra from the guilt of it. "Ma, this is—" Lyra's voice cracked. "This is exactly the kind of predatory structure I used to flag in audits. You didn't just take a loan, you were trapped in one." "I know that now," Rosa whispered. "I didn't know it then." Lyra flipped to the most recent page, and everything in her went very still. A transfer notice, dated 3 weeks ago. The entire outstanding balance of Rosa's debt, every cent of that crushing $200,000, had been purchased and absorbed by a holding company. Lyra recognized the shell name immediately, because she'd seen it hours earlier, carved discreetly into a brass plaque near Paxson's estate gate. Castellano Holdings. "He bought your debt," Lyra said slowly, the pieces slamming together with sickening speed. 3 weeks ago, right before he showed up at your door with a marriage contract." Rosa's silence was answer enough. Lyra stood, folder trembling in her grip. 10 years of hard-won independence, curdling into something much darker. It hadn't been fate. It hadn't been some poetic decade-long search for a woman whose spreadsheets he'd fallen in love with. He'd found her mother buried under debt, bought that debt like a leash, and then walked in with a folder of his own, a contract instead of a rescue, ownership disguised as devotion. "He didn't fall in love with my mind," Lyra said, more to herself than to Rosa. "He found a woman he could corner, a mother he could leverage. And he wrapped it in a pretty story about audits on a wall so I wouldn't notice I was being bought. Lyra, I don't think. I have to go." Lyra was already moving, folder clutched against her chest like evidence, because that's exactly what it was. 10 years of reading financial documents had taught her one unshakable truth. Money never told stories. Money told facts. And the facts said Paxson Castellano had manufactured her mother's desperation into his own personal opportunity. The drive back to the estate felt endless, rage building with every mile, replacing the fragile trust that had started cracking open in his study the night before. By the time the SUV pulled through the estate gates, Lyra was out of the car before it fully stopped, folder in hand, storming past startled guards who didn't dare stop her. She found Paxson in his study again, standing exactly where he'd stood the night before, as if he'd been waiting. "You bought my mother's debt," Lyra said, voice shaking with a fury sharper than anything the humiliating blind date had ever managed to carve into her. 3 weeks before you showed up with a marriage contract. You didn't fall in love with a decade-old spreadsheet, Paxson. You engineered a trap and dressed it up as destiny." For the first time since she'd met him, Paxson Castellano looked genuinely blindsided, not by the accusation itself, but by how close and how devastatingly wrong it was. "Lyra," he said carefully, "you need to sit down, because what you just found isn't the whole truth, and the part you're missing is going to be a lot harder to hear. Sit down, Lyra. please. I'm not sitting down, I'm listening. That's the only courtesy I have left for you. Lyra stood in the center of the study, the silver-lined folder still clutched against her chest like a shield, refusing to let the softness in his voice undo the fury she'd driven 40 minutes to deliver. Paxson studied her for a long moment, then walked to his desk and pulled out a folder of his own, thicker than hers, edges lined with color-coded tabs, the kind of organization that suggested he'd built this file expecting exactly this confrontation. "Sit down," he said again, quieter. "Not because I'm asking you to trust me. Because you're about to see numbers, and you told me yourself, numbers don't lie. Read them before you decide I'm the villain in this story." Something in his certainty made her hesitate. She sat, reluctantly, on the edge of the leather chair across from his desk, and let him slide the folder toward her. The first page was a loan origination document. The original silver-lined paperwork from 5 years ago, the one that had started her mother's nightmare. Lyra had seen a copy already, but this one had something hers didn't, a referral signature at the bottom, the name of the broker who'd steered Rosa toward Silverline in the first place. Marcus Doyle. Lyra's blood went cold. Marcus, her ex-fiancé, the man she'd almost married 8 years ago, before she found out he'd been quietly funneling money out of their shared accounts and vanished the moment she confronted him. She hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in years. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Marcus left the city after we broke up. He wasn't even in contact with my mother." "He was never gone," Paxson said. "He just stopped using his own name." Marcus Doyle became a financial consultant working referral commissions for predatory lenders, steering desperate people, especially people connected to you, into structured debt traps he profited from every time the balance grew. Your mother wasn't a random target, Lyra. She was leverage he kept in his back pocket in case he ever needed it against you again. Lyra flipped through the pages with shaking hands. Commission statements, referral records, a paper trail stretching back years, all pointing to the same conclusion. Marcus hadn't disappeared out of shame after the engagement fell apart. He'd disappeared into a quieter kind of predation, one that eventually circled back and found her mother standing in the wreckage of Lyra's failed bakery, desperate enough to sign anything. "Why would he target my mother specifically?" Her voice had gone hoarse. "Because he knew exactly what would happen once the debt matured," Paxson said grimly. "He was patient. He let the interest compound for years, knowing eventually the balance would become unmanageable, knowing your mother would never tell you, because she'd rather drown quietly than watch you blame yourself for the bakery's collapse. And once the debt was crushing enough, he planned to offer her help, a settlement, in exchange for information about you, or worse, access to you, through her." The room went very quiet. Lyra stared at the final page in the folder, a recorded conversation transcript, obtained through channels she didn't ask about, and somehow already knew not to question, where Marcus discussed collecting on the Vasilenko account with unmistakable intent. "How did you find this?" she asked finally. "Because the moment my contact confirmed your identity 2 years ago, I didn't just watch you," Paxson admitted. "I had my people quietly investigate everyone connected to you, anyone who might pose a threat." Marcus surfaced almost immediately. It took 18 months to trace the full scope of what he'd built. By the time we confirmed he was actively circling your mother's debt again, ready to make his move, I didn't have the luxury of a slow introduction, Lyra. I bought the debt out from under him 3 weeks ago, paid it off in full, erased it completely, specifically so he couldn't use it as a weapon against either of you." Lyra sat back, the folder heavy in her lap, 10 years of professional instinct warring against the ache building in her throat. "And the marriage contract?" "Was never about ownership," Paxson said, quieter now, something raw slipping through his composed exterior for the first time. It was the fastest legal mechanism. I had to place you and your mother under my protection immediately, before Marcus realized the debt was gone and tried something else. A contract, on paper, looks cold. I know that. But it moved faster than courtship ever could have, and speed was the only thing standing between your family and a man who'd already proven what he was willing to do. Lyra looked down at the transcript again, at Marcus's own words laid bare in black and white, and felt something inside her chest finally give way. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the collapse of a story she'd built in one furious car ride, replaced by one far uglier and far more real. "I came here ready to hate you," she said quietly. "I know." Paxson's voice was gentle now, stripped of its earlier formality. "I'd rather you hate me for the truth than trust me for a lie, Lyra. That's the only promise I can actually keep." For the first time since the SUVs had blocked her mother's driveway, Lyra let herself really look at him, not as a stranger wielding power, not as a man buying his way into her life, but as someone who had spent a decade quietly protecting a woman he'd never met, and 3 weeks dismantling a threat she hadn't even known existed. "I need time," she said finally, "but I don't think you're the enemy anymore." Paxson nodded slowly, something like relief loosening his shoulders. "Then, that's further than I hoped to get today." 2 weeks later, Lyra stood in front of a mirror in a dress she never would have chosen for herself. Deep emerald, elegant, tailored by someone Paxson's assistant had quietly hired without asking Lyra's dress size out loud, as if sparing her the humiliation of saying the number. She smoothed the fabric over her hips and felt the old, familiar voice creep in. "Everyone will be looking at you, not the good kind of looking. You look like you're about to walk into a fight," Paxson said from the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks. "I am," Lyra said. "Just not the kind with fists." The Castellano Foundation's annual charity gala was held in a Manhattan ballroom, dripping with chandeliers and old money. The kind of event where syndicate business was conducted in the polite disguise of philanthropy. Lyra had agreed to come as Paxson's official guest. A public declaration, he'd told her, that the woman beside him wasn't a secret or an obligation, but a choice. She regretted agreeing within the first 10 minutes. The whispers started before they'd even reached the main floor. Not loud enough to be confronted, just loud enough to land. "Is that really who he brought? I heard she used to run some little bakery that went under. 40 if she's a day. He could have anyone." Lyra kept her chin level and her spine straight, the way she'd trained herself to do at every client meeting, where men twice her size in ego assumed her number crunching was secretarial work. But it stung differently here, surrounded by silk and diamonds, every glance sliding over her body like she was a math error someone hadn't caught in time. Paxson's hand found the small of her back, steady. "Ignore them. I've had 20 years of practice," she said quietly. "I don't need the pep talk." It was at the dinner tables, an hour later, that things shifted. Vittorio Ansaldi, head of a rival syndicate family, a heavy-set man with a laugh too loud for the room, leaned toward Paxson with a smirk that didn't quite hide his contempt. "Castellano, I heard congratulations are in order. Didn't take you for the type to marry for." His eyes flicked deliberately to Lyra. "Sentiment." Paxson's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lyra set down her wineglass with deliberate calm. "Actually, Mr. Ansaldi, I'd love to discuss something other than sentiment," she said pleasantly. "Your foundation's disclosed donations this year total $4.2 million. Public record, easy enough to check. But your shipping subsidiary's tax filings in the Caymans show outbound transfers of nearly $11 million over the same period, routed through a marine logistics shell registered to your nephew's name." She smiled, sweet and razor-edged. "I only know that because forensic accounting happens to be my profession, not because I went looking." It's remarkable what surfaces in public filings when nobody expects the woman at the table to actually read them. The table went silent. Ansaldi's smirk froze, then curdled into something far less comfortable. That's speculation, he managed. It's math, Lyra said simply. And math doesn't care whose nephew it embarrasses. A ripple moved through the surrounding tables. Not gossip this time, but something closer to recalibration. Guests who'd been whispering about her dress size 10 minutes earlier were now watching her with the wary attention usually reserved for men twice her physical size and half her intelligence. Ansaldi excused himself moments later, face pale, phone already pressed to his ear before he'd cleared the ballroom doors. Word would travel fast. Federal auditors loved a tip that arrived with receipts already attached, and Lyra had a strong suspicion that within a week, Ansaldi's shell company would be the subject of considerably less pleasant conversations than a charity dinner. Paxson hadn't said a word through the entire exchange. When Lyra finally turned to him, half expecting reprimand for stirring chaos at a diplomatic event, she found something else entirely on his face. Open, unguarded pride, the kind he clearly hadn't planned on letting show in public. "You just publicly humiliated a rival family boss at a charity gala," he said, voice low. "Was I not supposed to?" "No," Paxson said, and something in his tone had shifted, warmer and rougher at once. "You were supposed to be exactly what you just were. I didn't bring you tonight to be decoration on my arm, Lyra. I brought you because I already knew what would happen the moment someone underestimated you." Across the ballroom, his inner circle, men who'd spent 2 weeks treating Lyra with polite, distant tolerance, were now watching her with an entirely different kind of attention. Not the assessing, dismissive gaze she'd endured all evening, but something closer to respect, the wary recalculation reserved for someone who'd just proven they belonged, in rooms other people spent lifetimes trying to survive. "They were laughing at my dress size an hour ago," Lyra said quietly, watching the room reorganize itself around her. "They'll remember your mind for a lot longer than they remember your dress size," Paxson said. "I promise you that." For the first time since the humiliating blind date on her 40th birthday, Lyra felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not vindication exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something steadier. The unmistakable, foreign sensation of being exactly enough, in a room built to make her feel like less. The call came at 2 a.m., 3 weeks after the gala, and Lyra woke to the sound of Paxson's voice in the hallway, low and urgent, saying words like convoy and compromised and get her out now. By the time he opened her bedroom door, his composure had cracked into something she'd never seen on him. Real fear, barely leashed. "Someone hit my transport an hour ago," he said, already pulling a bag from her closet. "2 of my men are hurt. It wasn't random, Lyra. Someone's testing how far they can reach. I'm not taking chances with you." 2 hours later, they were in the Adirondacks, at a cabin so remote the GPS had struggled to find the road leading to it. No guards visible from the windows, though Lyra suspected they were there, hidden in the tree line. No phones except one secure line. Just pine trees, a wood stove, and silence so complete it made her own heartbeat sound loud. "You're safe here," Paxson said, setting down the last of the bags. "I promise you that." "Are you?" Lyra asked. "Because you look like a man who hasn't slept in a week, and it's only been 1 night." Something in his face softened, cracked open in a way she hadn't seen before. "I've spent 10 years imagining 100 versions of meeting you," he admitted quietly. "None of them involved almost losing you before we'd even had a real beginning." They didn't talk about the syndicate for the rest of that night. Paxson built a fire while Lyra found blankets, and somewhere between the crackle of burning wood and the wine he poured into mismatched mugs, because the cabin didn't have proper glasses, the careful distance between them finally began to dissolve. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said, curled into the corner of the couch, watching firelight flicker across his face. "That first night, at my mother's house, you said you fell in love with my mind before ever meeting me. But surely, once you actually saw me, the weight, the age, all of it, some part of you had to adjust the picture in your head." Paxson set down his mug slowly, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her stay exactly where she was. "Do you know what I actually thought, the moment I saw you standing in that doorway? That I wasn't what you pictured. That you were exactly what I pictured," he said, "except more. The reports on my wall showed me a mind that could dismantle a financial empire and rebuild it in 30 days. They never showed me the woman who'd raise her chin at a room full of people trying to make her small. They never showed me the way you look at numbers, like they're a language only you speak fluently. I didn't adjust anything, Lyra. I just kept discovering more of what I'd already fallen in love with. You don't have to say things like that just because we're alone in a cabin," she said, old defenses rising instinctively, the same ones she'd built after years of men who complimented her only when it benefited them. "I'm not saying it because we're alone," Paxson said, moving closer, his hand finding hers with a gentleness that startled her more than any grand gesture could have. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think somewhere along the way, men convinced you that being loved required you to be smaller. I don't want you smaller, Lyra. I've spent my whole life around people who take up as much space as they can, just to survive. You take up space with your mind, your wit, your presence, and I have never once wanted you to shrink any part of that." Something in Lyra's chest, some wall she'd built brick by brick after every rejection, every cruel comment, every man who measured her worth against a number on a scale, began, slowly and unwillingly, to come apart. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, voice thick. "I don't know how to let someone see all of me and not flinch." "Then let me show you," Paxson said quietly, "that I already have." What passed between them that night in the quiet cabin wasn't loud or dramatic. No fireworks, no cinematic sweep. It was slower than that, and truer for it. It was Paxson tracing the curve of her shoulder, like he was memorizing something precious, rather than tolerating something imperfect. It was Lyra, for the first time in 20 years, letting a man's hands linger without the reflexive urge to apologize for her own body. It was whispered words in the dark that had nothing to do with contracts or syndicates or debts, only the unfamiliar, overwhelming sensation of being wanted exactly as she was, not despite her fullness or her age, but because of the whole woman those years had shaped. By morning, sunlight spilling gold across the cabin floor, Lyra woke wrapped in Paxson's arms and realized, with a clarity that startled her, that the vow she'd made on her 40th birthday, the furious promise to swear off love forever, had quietly, irreversibly broken, not because a man had come to rescue her, but because, for the first time in her life, she'd let herself be truly seen, and instead of looking away, he'd only looked closer. The peace lasted 11 days. Lyra was reviewing quarterly reports at the estate's kitchen table, a habit she'd kept even as a guest, unable to sit idle, when Paxson's phone began ringing without stopping. By the third call, his face had gone the color of old paper. "What is it?" Lyra asked, already standing. "Every operating account we hold has been frozen," Paxson said, staring at his phone like it might rearrange itself into better news. "All of them, simultaneously. 3 banks, 6 accounts, gone in the space of an hour." Within the day, the full scope became clear, and it was far worse than a simple freeze. A coalition had assembled against him. Vittorio Ansaldi, humiliated and furious since the gala, had allied with 2 corrupt city officials, Lyra recognized from financial disclosure filings she'd once flagged during an old audit. Together, they'd orchestrated something brutally efficient: anonymous tips to federal regulators alleging tax fraud, timed precisely with a coordinated freeze of Paxson's accounts through banking contacts the officials controlled. "They're not trying to end you," Lyra said, spreading printouts across the war room table an hour later, her earlier fear hardening into something colder and more useful. "They're trying to bankrupt you publicly, then let the feds finish what they started. If they can freeze your legitimate assets and simultaneously plant fraud allegations, every bank, contractor, and business partner you have will cut ties before the ink's dry on the indictment. You won't need to be convicted to lose everything. You just need to look guilty long enough." Paxson's men filled the room, tension radiating off every one of them. His right hand, a broad, quiet man named Dario, shook his head grimly. "We've handled threats before. Guns, territory, rival hits. This isn't our language. It's mine," Lyra said. Every head in the room turned. "I've spent 10 years reading exactly this kind of playbook," she continued, pulling a legal pad toward her, pen already moving. "Hostile financial takeovers don't happen through violence. They happen through paperwork, timing, and manufactured panic. Whoever built this knew precisely which accounts to hit and precisely which regulators to tip off, which means this wasn't improvised. It was engineered by someone who understands corporate law as well as I do." "Can you fix it?" Paxson asked. And for the first time since she'd met him, she heard real uncertainty in his voice. Not fear for himself, she realized, but fear of what happened to her and her mother if his empire crumbled and left them exposed. "I can try," Lyra said, "but I need full access. Every account, every shell company, every filing you've ever made, clean or otherwise. I can't build a defense around half the truth." Paxson didn't hesitate. "You have it. All of it." The syndicate's inner circle exchanged uneasy glances. A decade of guarded secrecy handed over in a single sentence to a woman who'd been part of their world for barely 6 weeks. But Paxson held Lyra's gaze, steady and certain, and something passed between them that silenced any argument before it started. For the next 3 days, Lyra barely slept. She commandeered the war room, covering the walls with the same kind of frantic, color-coded charts that had once hung there as framed trophies of her past work. Except now, she was building them in real time, tracing the exact shape of the trap closing around Paxson's empire. What she found made her blood run cold. The freeze wasn't random. It targeted only the accounts Paxson had painstakingly legitimized over the past decade. The clean money, the legally defensible enterprises he'd spent years building specifically to transition his family's business away from its criminal origins. His genuinely dirty accounts, the ones buried deeper and better hidden, remained untouched. "They're not trying to expose your crimes," Lyra said slowly, staring at the pattern laid bare across her charts. "They're trying to destroy the parts of your empire that were actually clean, so all that's left standing when the smoke clears is the criminal infrastructure. They want you cornered into staying exactly what your father was, because a fully legitimate Castellano empire is a threat to everyone still operating in the shadows." Paxson went very still. "Ansaldi doesn't have the financial sophistication for something this precise." "No," Lyra agreed, something clicking into place with sickening clarity, as she cross-referenced a filing name against records she'd pulled from an entirely different case years ago. "But someone advising him does." She turned her legal pad around, sliding it across the table toward him, and pointed to a name buried in a consulting contract dated 8 months prior. A name that made the room go dead silent. Marcus Doyle. "He's not gone," Lyra said, voice tight with fury and something colder underneath it. "He didn't disappear after you paid off my mother's debt. He just found new clients. Clients with the resources to actually hurt you. This isn't about the money anymore, Paxson. This is personal. He's using your empire to get to me, one more time, from a different angle. Paxson's expression hardened into something dangerous and controlled, the syndicate boss reasserting himself beneath the man she'd fallen for in a quiet cabin. Then we don't just survive this, he said. We end it, permanently. Lyra looked around the war room, at the frightened enforcers, the frozen accounts, the entire empire teetering on the edge of collapse because of a man who'd once tried to ruin her personally and had now escalated to ruining her family professionally. "Give me 4 days," she said, already reaching for her laptop. "I know exactly how to burn his entire strategy down before the federal warrants even reach a judge's desk." Lyra didn't leave the war room for 4 days. Paxson brought her coffee at hours that blurred into each other, watching her build a counter-strategy with the same quiet intensity she remembered from the gala. Except now, there was no audience, no dress, no whispers about her body. Just Lyra, 3 laptops, a wall of financial records, and a fury sharpened into something precise and unstoppable. "You should sleep," Paxson said on the second night, setting down another mug she hadn't touched. "Marcus doesn't sleep on this," Lyra said without looking up. "Neither do I." While Paxson's enforcers handled the physical side of the war, men stationed outside the estate, quiet conversations with contacts who could confirm whether Ansaldi's soldiers were mobilizing for anything worse than paperwork, Lyra fought a different battle entirely, one waged in filings, wire transfers, and the kind of buried documentation only someone trained to hunt financial ghosts could uncover. The first breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on day 2, when Lyra traced a shell company Marcus had used in the referral scheme against her mother years earlier. A company he'd apparently kept alive, dormant but registered, and recently reactivated to funnel consulting fees from Ansaldi's coalition. It was sloppy. Marcus had always been sloppy, arrogant enough to believe no one would ever connect the dots back to him twice. "Got you," Lyra whispered, staring at the screen. By day 3, the picture had fully assembled itself. The corrupt city officials backing Ansaldi's coalition had been quietly diverting municipal contract funds into offshore accounts for years, using the same shell company architecture Marcus had built. It wasn't just fraud against Paxson, it was fraud against the city itself, hidden behind a dozen layers of holding companies and falsified audits. Lyra recognized the pattern instantly, because it was nearly identical to the syndicate collapse she'd rescued a decade ago. Except this time, the criminals wore government badges instead of family crests. "This is bigger than Paxson," she told Dario, spreading the final chart across the war room table. "These officials have been laundering diverted infrastructure funds for at least 6 years. Ansaldi's coalition isn't just trying to bankrupt Paxson. They're using his takedown as cover to bury their own tracks before anyone gets close enough to notice." "Can you prove it?" Dario asked. "I already have." Lyra pulled up the final document, a forensic reconciliation, 40 pages long, cross-referencing every fraudulent transfer against the exact regulatory filing numbers the officials had used to justify freezing Paxson's accounts. The same people who tipped off federal regulators about Paxson's supposed tax fraud have been committing actual tax fraud for years. All I have to do is make sure the right people see this at the right time. Paxson arrived as she finished compiling the final packet, exhaustion and something like awe etched into his face. "What happens if you send this?" "I'm not sending anything." Lyra allowed herself the smallest smile, the first in 4 days. "I'm filing it. Anonymously, through a legal counter-audit request. With the same federal regulators, they tipped off against you. When their own fraud surfaces under formal review, any allegations against you collapse instantly, because the officials making them will be too busy defending themselves to pursue anyone else. And Ansaldi? His shell companies are financing this entire coalition, Lyra said. The moment the officials go down, the money trail leads straight to him. I've already flagged his offshore accounts to the same regulatory body, the ones I mentioned so politely at the gala. Her smile sharpened. Turns out, 4.2 million in disclosed donations looks very different next to 11 million in undisclosed transfers, when a federal auditor actually goes looking. At dawn on day 4, Lyra hit submit on the filing. The war room silent, except for the hum of laptops and the exhausted breathing of people who'd spent 4 days waiting for a woman with a legal pad to save an empire guns couldn't protect. The response came faster than anyone expected. By that afternoon, news broke of a sweeping municipal corruption investigation. 2 city officials placed under immediate federal scrutiny, assets frozen pending inquiry. Ansaldi's name surfaced within hours, his shell companies collapsing under the weight of an audit trail Lyra had built with surgical precision. The tax fraud allegations against Paxson, suddenly overshadowed by a scandal 10 times larger, quietly dissolved. No formal charges ever filed, the regulators far too occupied with bigger, more embarrassing fish. Marcus Doyle's name appeared once, buried in a secondary filing, connected to the shell company scheme as a person of interest. Lyra read that single line 3 times, feeling something settle in her chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite peace, something steadier than either. "It's over," Dario said quietly, staring at the news reports flooding in. She actually did it. Paxson found Lyra still sitting in the war room hours later, the chaos finally quiet. Morning light spilling across charts that had, days earlier, held his entire empire's survival in the balance. "You saved everything," he said, crouching beside her chair. "Not just the money. All of it." "I didn't do it for the empire," Lyra said, meeting his eyes, exhaustion and clarity tangled together in her expression. "I did it because Marcus tried to use you to reach me one last time, and I wasn't going to let him win twice." Paxson reached for her hand, the same way he had that first night in the cabin, and for the first time since the black SUVs had blocked her mother's driveway, Lyra understood completely. She hadn't been rescued into this life. She'd fought her way into being indispensable to it. 2 months after the war room, the courtyard of Paxson's estate had been transformed. Long tables draped in white linen, strings of lights woven through the old oak trees. Every capo, enforcer, and associate in Paxson's organization stood gathered on the lawn, along with people Lyra never expected to see there. Rosa, seated in the front row in a new dress Lyra had bought her, dabbing her eyes before anything had even happened. Lyra stood beside Paxson at the head of the courtyard, still unsure what this gathering was actually for. He'd only told her to wear something comfortable and trust him, which after everything they'd survived together, she finally, fully did. 2 months ago, Paxson said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, addressing his entire organization rather than just Lyra. "Most of you watched me hand a woman a marriage contract because it was the fastest legal tool I had to protect her family from a threat I couldn't explain in time. Some of you thought I'd lost my mind. Some of you assumed it was strategy, a merger, an alliance, nothing more." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the original folder, the same leather folder from that first night in Rosa's living room, the binding contract that had started everything. "You were wrong," Paxson said, and without ceremony, he tore the document in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the grass at his feet. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Lyra felt only her own pulse roaring in her ears, watching him destroy the thing that had once felt like a chain and now felt like the discarded skin of something they'd both outgrown. "That contract protected her, when I didn't have time for anything gentler," he continued. "But it was never what she deserved, and it's certainly not what she's earned since." He turned fully toward Lyra now, and the courtyard seemed to hold its breath along with her. You built me a legitimate empire out of nothing but numbers and refusal to let fear win. You exposed Ansaldi's corruption at a dinner table with nothing but a smile and public record. You buried a federal fraud allegation and a rival syndicate's finances in 4 sleepless days, using nothing but a legal pad and a mind sharper than anyone in this yard has ever encountered. I didn't marry a woman to protect her, Lyra. I fell in love with a partner I don't deserve, and I'm done pretending the contract was ever the point. He lowered himself to one knee on the grass, and from his jacket pocket produced a small box. Not the elaborate, showy ring Lyra might have expected from a man of his means, but something simpler, elegant, clearly chosen by someone who'd spent months paying attention to exactly what she was, rather than what people assumed she should want. "Lyra Vasilenko," Paxson said, voice steady despite the crowd, despite everything. "I'm not asking your mother this time. I'm asking you, not because I need a contract to keep you safe anymore. Marcus is finished, Ansaldi is finished, and every threat that once justified moving fast is gone. I'm asking because I want to spend the rest of my life earning a yes I actually deserve. Marry me, not as insurance, not as strategy, because you are, without a single exception, the most extraordinary person I have ever known." Lyra looked down at him, at the courtyard full of hardened men watching with something that had shifted over 2 months from suspicion into genuine respect, at her mother crying openly in the front row, and felt every humiliating memory of her 40th birthday dissolve into something she never thought she'd feel again. Not vindication, not relief, but simple, unshakable certainty. "Yes," she said, and the courtyard erupted into applause that startled birds out of the oak trees. But Paxson wasn't finished. As he slid the ring onto her finger, he produced a second document from his jacket. This one freshly drawn, nothing like the binding contract he'd torn apart moments earlier. "This transfers 49% ownership of Castellano Holdings' legitimate enterprises into your name," he said, holding it out to her. "Not as a wife who benefits from her husband's success. As an equal partner who built half of what this company has become since the day you walked into my study and found your own forgotten genius hanging on my wall." Lyra stared at the document, then at him, understanding fully for the first time what he was offering. Not rescue, not protection, not even love alone, but genuine, legal equality in an empire she had, quite literally, saved from ruin with her own hands. "I don't need the paperwork to know I'm your equal, Paxson," she said, voice thick. "I know," he said, smiling. "But everyone else in this courtyard needs to see it in writing. So there's never a moment, for the rest of our lives, where anyone forgets exactly whose mind built the empire they're standing in." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the lights strung through the oak trees flickered gold against the darkening sky, Rosa found her daughter standing quietly at the edge of the courtyard, watching Paxson laugh with Dario near the tables. "You look like a woman who finally believes she's enough," Rosa said softly. Lyra glanced down at the ring on her finger, then at the torn scraps of the original contract still scattered somewhere in the grass behind her. The last remnant of a beginning built on urgency and fear, replaced now by something chosen freely, in daylight, in front of everyone who mattered. "I stopped waiting to be enough," Lyra said, smiling for the first time without a single trace of the old ache beneath it. "Turns out I always was. I just needed someone who could actually read the numbers."